All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chapter 6's lecture. This is going to start our unit on policing. Chapter 6, 7, and 8 will be on policing for the next few weeks. And after the completion of Chapter 8 is when your first writing assignment will be due, if you so choose to do that writing assignment. That will be on the policing topic. That is due in a couple of weeks, just to make sure everybody is aware of that. But this is going to introduce policing. We're going to go over the history of it. We're going to go over the structure of police departments and kind of get down a base knowledge on policing when it comes to the history of it in England, as well as the ways that it applied to American policing. So learning objectives, obviously, they're on the first and second slides. They're important. Everybody seemed to be doing good on the first two. The first exam, please make sure that this is where you're starting when it comes to your exams. These are the things that I need to know that you know, so I have to test you on them. And here's more learning objectives on this slide as well. So an introduction. The first thing that we need to cover is about how the United States does not have a centralized form of government, neither do we have a centralized form of a police force. So the best way to understand this is if you think about your Central American and South American countries who have problems with cartels and drugs and black markets and things like that, you're going to realize that one of the reasons why they have been able to keep having these issues is because one of the reasons is because they have a national police department that the dictator or president, if you will, of these countries has control over. And somehow, some way, these governments have become corrupt and they have this national police force that is essentially protecting the cartels and all the drug operations that are going on. So in the United States, like it says in the second bullet point, we have no national police force. We have over 18,000 separate police agencies determined between federal, state, local jurisdictions and stuff like that. One of the reasons why we have so many police agencies and why we don't have a centralized police agency is because if you think about it, the one thing we were scared of when we made our government, when we made had a Declaration of Independence, made the Constitution, wrote that, everything else, we were afraid of tyranny. So seeing that we were afraid of tyranny, we definitely did not want there to be a national police force that, I'll just use George Washington, for example, because he was our first president, could take over the entire country, this, that, and the next. So police agencies, they range from small town police departments to large metropolitan police departmts. We also have county agencies. Sheriffs are usually your most popular county agency. You can think of the Richland County Sheriff's Departments. That's a county agency. They don't have any jurisdiction in Lexington County, for example. They stay in Richland County. We also have federal agencies, all your three-letter agencies like the DEA, ICE, Department of Justice, FBI, things like that, CIA. And each of these agencies operates under its own jurisdiction, which we're going to get into jurisdiction in the next couple of chapters. Your main jurisdiction is based on location and geography. So like I said, with Richland County, they have jurisdiction in Richland County. They cannot make an arrest or do operations in Lexington unless it's some joint task force that they're helping out with or something like that. So the English system of policing, like I said, we're going over the history of policing, and the best way to go about that is to start way at the beginning. So the English system of policing, the original establishment of policing in England started with the Norman Conquest in 1066. Seeing that the Normans increased the power of the state, they needed something to enforce state control. The first thing that they established was a night watch to protect the interests of the cities, if you think about it, and it's still true today. Criminals commit a majority of their crimes at night because they feel like they can flee better, they can't be seen, this, that, and the next. So the first thing that they did was create the night watch. On the other hand, they eventually created what they refer to as the ward was added, and they were responsible for similar duties during the daytime. And then the most capable of these officers, if you will, was appointed to be the role of the constable. So the constable is the equivalent of your modern day sheriff or police chief, if you will. They were responsible for overseeing both the ward and the night watch. So like I said, the sheriff, if you want to know where the term sheriff comes from, it refers to as the shire reeve. So if you think of all the shires in England. That just kind of refers to as a city or a town or a village. Is kind of how that translates. So the shire reeve has kind of been Americanized into the term sheriff. But sheriffs originally were appointed to protect the king's interests throughout England. So sheriffs were responsible for overseeing tax collection, overseeing and making sure that nobody was trying to overthrow the government of any kind like that. That was the sheriff's job. They were supposed to do that in their jurisdiction, wherever their shire was. Another thing that was popular during this time, and that's important to know, is the Bow Street Runners. They're kind of the equivalent of an early police force. They patrol the Bow Street district, like you see. They're the equivalent of kind of your modern local police force. This is kind of what you're going to think of as your local city police force. They were responsible just for the Bow Street district. It was the place where there was the most crime. There was a lot of prostitution and vagrancy and drunkenness back in the day in the Bow Street district. If you want to go look it up, some of the early documentation of the Bow Street district is very interesting if you want to look at how they police that and stuff. But it's obviously not mandatory or anything. So, and then in 1822, Sir Robert Peel, which you will need to know the name Sir Robert Peel. He is the OG of policing, especially in London, and it obviously translated into America. But in 1822 is when he was facing the problem of rising crime in London. And if you want to look at England's Home Secretary, take of that as like the Secretary of State or Secretary of Homeland Security, if you will, if that makes the connection for you. So he created a proposal for a professional police force instead of just having these people that were hired because they were buddies or because they were big and strong and they were the people that were the bouncers at the bars. Actually professionalizing the London police force is what he proposed. So in 1829 is when the Metropolitan Police Act came through and it was passed, and they hired 1,000 new officers from outside the city to avoid political corruption. So we're going to get into corruption and discussing that in American policing eventually, but they had the same thing over in England when Robert Peel was establishing the London Metropolitan Police Force. They, in an attempt to eliminate the corruption, they brought people from outside of London, people that didn't have any ties to London, so that they weren't already corrupted. They could come in, they could have a professional police force, and they could establish that to kind of combat the rising crime in London that he was trying to fix. And if you were wondering why they were called Bobbies, it's because Robert Peel. That's why they became known as Bobbies. So the impact, like I said, of English policing on America was profound. If you look at the Judiciary Act of 1789, that's when we established the U.S. Federal Marshals. There's a link there to if you want to go look at the actual document and read through it and see what was entailed in that. You can. This was the main jobs that they have were to serve the courts when it came to territorial possessions, land owned by the United States, but it wasn't yet formed into states. So, American system of policing. So Boston faced serious problem of crime and disorder between 1834 and 1838. There was these three huge riots in the city of Boston. If you want to go look those up, there's tons of documentation of that as well. That took place throughout the entire city. In 1838, a bill was passed to create a new police department and appoint police officers. The reason why this is laid out like this is because you see how closely mirrored the development of American policing was to English policing just a couple years later, and due to these riots, especially in Boston. So the Boston Police Department was officially created in 1854. However, New York Police Department was officially created in 1845, but one of the reasons why Boston is kind of not necessarily credited with the first American police force, I don't want to confuse you because clearly New York had the first American police force, but they were the locale that most closely mirrored the process of developing a police force. They had the large-scale riots, they had the crime problem, they went through and did it legislatively, and then they had their police force. It just took them a little bit longer to get funding, essentially, is what happened. And that's why it's not formalized until 1854. So now we're going to get into the four main areas of American policing. This is important to know, especially the historical timeline and the transitions from one era to the next are very important, but we're going to outline all of that for you. So the political area is from about 1830, so the very beginning of American policing, to about 1930. So during the political area, many things are common for police today. They dealt with stray animals, crude counseling, ran soup kitchens, did all those service activities that they do today. However, in the late 1800s, they were run by this political machine with the spoil system and the patronage system. Police brutality was common. It was very, very, very common. Basically, what you need to know about the political area is politics governed policing all throughout the country, all throughout the different jurisdictions, all throughout the states. Essentially, these political moguls were somehow, some way getting their cousin, for example, to be the sheriff or the local police chief. And they were protecting this political person's interest throughout the city, and they were continuing to win elections. They were continuing to make absurd amounts of money on extorting money from local businesses for protection, for example. That's kind of the spoil system and the patronage system in a nutshell for you. So, and then we get to the reform, or I also put / the professional era. That's another way that you're going to see this through text, or some people are going to discuss it in future classes. Essentially, the catalyst for this would be prohibition. This is when we're trying to really regulate something nationally. So you're going to see that they realize that the political era and all this the police brutality and the political extortion that was going on was just not appropriate for this timeline. So this is when you're going to see essentially the Wickersham Commission, and by President Hoover, was done in 1928. You're going to see that is going to be kind of the formal start of the professional era. So if you think about it, 1928 is when the Wickersham Commission was formed. So about 1930 is when they're doing their report. The report confirmed that there was police brutality throughout the entire United States. It wasn't just in one location. It was throughout the entire United States. This political machine that was running our policing system was absurdly spread throughout the entire country. So essentially what we needed to do was we need to professionalize the police department. That's why the professional era is another way that it is referred to, along with the reform era. Another huge name that you are going to know, and I think you've already been exposed to, is August Vollmer. He was the police chief from Berkeley, California. He is essentially the father of the modern American police force. He was the person that kind of proposed the professional model of policing. It had a lot of organization to it. It really got to demand the most out of police officers, and it established a lot of checks and balances as well throughout a police department at multiple levels. So, and then we get into the community era. So if you think about it, we're starting community era in 1980. In 1960, obviously none of us were alive at this time, but if you think of the 1960s and the things that were going on, especially in minority communities and stuff like that throughout the 1960s, there was a lot of brutality still. There was a lot of white police officers and Black individuals having a lot of run-ins. A lot of racism was exhibited by police departments in the 1960s. So if you think about kind of the lag time of trying to fix it, in 1980 is when we're finally getting into this community era of policing. So like it says in the second bullet point, the police resorted to old tactics to deal with new problems. Essentially, these new problems, our community relations began to fall apart, and it was fueled by the baby boom. There was too many people to police. It was hard to kind of develop relationships. And then there was also just some systemic racism going throughout police departments throughout the country. So it wasn't, they resorted back to old tactics very easily. It's kind of how all that abuse came through police departments across the nation. So the solution to these is police community relations, community police, problem-oriented policing. These things are terms and practices that you're going to see a lot throughout your coursework here. But these are the ways that we tried to provide solutions to all of the 1960 era problems, if you want to think of it that way. So, and now is when we are in the Homeland Security era. So, if you could have guessed, as a result of 9/11, we have the Department of Homeland Security now. So, we are more focused with terrorism, both domestic and international, across the board with policing now. Even small level police departments are having protocols in place for any sort of natural disaster, any sort of terror attack, anything like that. We have a national response framework. We have police sharing information through fusion centers. We have national databases on police reports and police statistics. Obviously, it heightened all of our awareness on 9/11 of the things that could happen. We have taken a step towards unifying our police departments in an attempt to better communicate across jurisdiction lines. Before 9/11, we really just had 18,000 separate jurisdictions, if you want to think of it that way. Now we have all these joint terrorism task forces. We have all these fusion centers. We have police that are better able to do their job because they have information from other police departments. They've been sharing practices. They've been learning from each other. And it's all kind of been fueled through this Homeland Security era mindset of protecting the United States against any sort of terroristic threat. So policing in America today, we have a ton of municipal police is who kind of dominates policing in America. We have over 18,000 agencies, and a majority of them are local police departments. They run from 0 officers, which, yes, you can have 0 officers. Some police departments in very, very rural areas don't actually have a formal police officer. They have somebody who acts more of a civilian patrol and performs civilian arrest duties for crimes that they know have happened. They report them to other larger agencies that can actually formally arrest them. And the head of it is a police chief. They've also referred to as a police commissioner. Usually you see commissioners in big areas. So you have the police commissioner of Chicago and New York. So we still have sheriff's offices and departments. We have state police. There are 49 state police agencies. Hawaii does not have a state police agency, just a little fun fact for you. And then there's kind of 2 different models with state police agencies. You have either a state police model or you have a highway patrol model. Technically, South Carolina, for example, has adopted both because we have both state troopers and a highway patrol. However, if it leans towards one more than the other, it would be the state police model, because the highway patrol is kind of just viewed as a branch of the state police. So constables and marshals, we have states in Texas and Pennsylvania, we have these. They're still kind of emanating from the whole Norman conquest that we discussed earlier. You can just see how that is still present in contemporary American policing. We also have special jurisdiction police, very specific jurisdictions. Like, this is where you have your game wardens, for example. Their jurisdiction isn't necessarily a geography or a geographical outline. Maybe they're assigned to counties. However, their jurisdiction is wildlife crimes, for example. That's a good way to think of special jurisdiction police. And we still do have tribal police. We have Native American lands. They have their own laws. They completely function with their own government systems. So they have their own police that a lot of them actually police themselves, but it doesn't make sense to send somebody from New York to police a Native American land, for example. So they have their own kind of tribal police. And then we have federal law enforcement. Obviously, they range from small agencies like the National Zoo, for example, has its own law enforcement branch, to large agencies such as the DEA, the FBI, Department of Justice, CIA, all those other three-letter agencies, what I refer to them as. We also have international policing. The CivPol recruits active police officers to serve as civilian peacekeepers around the world. We're going to get into UNPOL, which is the United Nations Police, and Interpol is the international police organization. It's got 190 member countries. Once again, the main goal of all those POL agencies, for example, is just to share information, better defend against terrorist attacks, communicate more. Ever since 9/11 and all the terrorist attacks in Europe in the early 2000s, and even through to the 2010s, obviously, has really heightened everybody's awareness with communicating information as much as you can. So when it comes to the structure of the modern police department, we are organized both along bureaucratic and military orientations. A lot of people refer to them as paramilitary organizations because they're essentially like military organizations, but they're not the military. That's kind of where the term paramilitary comes from. They have chain of commands, span of control, used to most effectively manage individuals is typically between 5 and 7 personnel. So that's how you're going to see the chain of command organized. You're going to have a sergeant, for example, is going to be responsible between 5 and 7 personnel because that is what research has indicated they are most adequately gauged to manage. It's kind of where cost benefit analysis comes into play. It's kind of where you can best utilize your resources. Division of labor among personnel helps divide responsibilities. We have specializations with SWAT teams and drug units and civilian patrols, stuff like that. Police discretion obviously is big throughout modern American policing. So in conclusion, jurisdiction, all these things, these are other topics that are important to know throughout Chapter 6. These are topics to kind of start your secondary review for the chapter. Names, dates, those transitions throughout the different eras of American policing are important, and knowing what principles we adopted from the English system and where they still are today are also important. But that's kind of the gist of Chapter 6. It's kind of the main talking points that I wanted to discuss, and it's a good start for you guys to go and read throughout the rest of Chapter 6. As always, if you have any questions, post them on the open discussion forum. Make sure that you are participating in that. Every couple of weeks, I'm going to have those different topics for you guys to open up a little bit more throughout the discussion forum so that we can get our participation points. But other than that, any questions, put them on the open discussion forum. I will monitor that and make sure that you have your quiz done by Tuesday at 11:59 p.m.